So, I welcome you all to the module 6 of this course. So, the module 6 is about behaviorism and learning perspective in terms of understanding personality. So, today we will be having lecture number 13, overall lecture number 13 and second lecture of this module 6. So, today's lecture is about a particular perspective within behavioral school of thought, that is operant conditioning and how it relates to personality. That is what we will be talking about in today's lecture. So, before we talk about today's lecture, let me give you a brief recap of last lecture. So, lecture 12 was about, again this is also the first lecture of this module, and it talked about Pavlovian classical conditioning perspective and how it relates to personality. So, we discussed the various basic concepts of Pavlov's theory of classical conditioning. We tried to understand the basic terms and the experiment that led to this development of this whole concept of classical conditioning. We discussed various processes associated with this concept of classical conditioning, including stimulus generalization, stimulus discrimination, extinction and so on. We also tried to understand how this perspective or learning perspective or classical conditioning perspective, how it relates to, how can it explain certain personality characteristics that human beings display. So, in that context we try to understand that classical conditioning can explain a lot of this emotional aspect or emotional aspect of human behavior, and it could some certain experimental research also provided evidence for certain traits like neuroticism and how it can be explained using classical conditioning. We also talked about J.B. Watson and his contribution to the behaviorism and the basic understanding that he contributed to the behaviorism. We also talked about how the basic ideas of behavioral therapy and some of the ideas from classical conditioning, how it can be used in the therapy sessions and so on. We also discussed at the end some of the later 90s and beginning of 2000 some of the renewed interest in classical conditioning and how this concept have been used in certain social psychological processes and so on. So, let us start now today's lecture. So, today's lecture we will be talking mostly about Skinner's operant conditioning. This is also very prominent paradigm within behaviorism. We will talk about process of operant conditioning, more specifically reinforcement and punishment we will be talking about. We will be also talking about schedules of reinforcement, the concept of shaping and how Skinner viewed the concept of personality. So, let us start. So, Skinner's perspective on behaviorism is generally called as radical behaviorism, because he was a very orthodox follower of scientific methodology, and his perspective on behaviorism, there was no scope for any kind of looseness around the basic ideas of behaviorism. So, his whole idea of behaviorism is also called as radical behaviorism. And he is probably one of the most important figure within behaviorism and overall the personalities of psychologists among all psychologists. So, he proposed something called as an operant conditioning. So, John J.B. Watson, who was also called as father of behaviorism, he left the field of psychology, and behaviorism was carried forward by many other psychologists later on, including people like Clark Hull, who developed a systematic driven theory of learning, John Dollard and Neil Miller, who applied Hull's theory to the phenomena of drives and intrapsychic conflicts within which are relevant to psychoanalysis and so on. So, he tried to apply some of the behavioral concept within psychoanalysis and so on. However, the most influential figure after J.B. Watson, not only within the behaviorism, but overall in the field of psychology, especially in the 20th century psychology, was B.F. Skinner, who was a Harvard psychologist known for his impact in the field and particularly his contribution to the school of behaviorism. Skinner is regarded as one of the most eminent psychologists of the last century, and he expanded behaviorism beyond just typical classical conditioning paradigm, and he made it a more comprehensive philosophy in terms of school of thought as a behaviorism as a school of thought. So, his contribution to behaviorism is immense, and that is what we will be looking about some of his contribution. He articulated broad behavioral principles and developed technologies aimed at improving human experiences. He not only provided various theoretical perspectives within behaviorism, he also gave many tools for implementation and application in various applied aspect of human life as well as animal life. So, he kind of expanded this whole scope of behaviorism beyond just typical learning and classical conditioning. Skinner was influenced, obviously he initially was influenced by the research of Pavlov and Watson, and he later on expanded their work. He did not specifically deny the existence of unconscious processes or inner state of human mind. He believed these are not necessary to explain human behavior, and a lot of the approach that are already existing at that time was most of them were unscientific, particularly psychoanalysis. Skinner accepted this principle of classical conditioning. Obviously, because that is also part of behaviorism, he accepted the principles of classical conditioning, but he believed that the application of classical conditioning in terms of explanation and application are very limited in the range of learning situations. So, he kind of expanded this whole scope. He argued that the consequence of behaviors are crucial to learning. So, it is one of the main concept of his theory that consequences of behavior are very important, which affects the likelihood of behavior being repeated. He said, in order to understand the impact of learning principles, one of the things that we should focus on is that what are the consequences of a behavior. When a person carries out a behavior, and what are the consequences of that behavior. So, that is more important in terms of determining whether that behavior will be repeated again or not. So, a lot of human behavior could be explained by understanding this relationship or association between the behavior and the consequences. In the case of classical conditioning, the association was between stimulus and response. Here, which are most of the stimulus response situation in the case of classical conditioning, so are very automatic processes, like when you, in the case of that experiment, dog experiment, food and saliva, these are automatic processes, and then the associations are formed within another neutral stimulus. But in case of operant conditioning or Skinner's concept, he was focusing more on normal behavioral thing that people do, and what are the consequences of those behavior. That determines a lot of varieties of behavior that we repeat or whether we stop some behavior. So, according to Skinner, the classical conditioning model of stimulus response is too simplistic. It can explain very simple phenomena, but it cannot explain a lot of complex phenomena and a lot of behavioral situations where more complexities are involved. So, he demonstrated that what happens after a response such as praise or criticism influences whether the behavior is repeated. For instance, praise for a seminar presentation increases the likelihood of future presentations, while criticism decreases it. So, this is an example where he was focusing on what is the consequences of a behavior, and that will determine the future course of action. So, if some behavior is rewarded, it is more likely to be repeated, and on the other hand, if a behavior is not rewarded or criticized or punished, then the possibility of such behavior decreases in future. So, let us understand this whole concept of operant conditioning as a concept of learning, and how it can explain lot of human behavior, lot of behavior, not only human as well as animal behavior. So, one of the basic concepts within operant conditioning is the concept of operands. From there the operant conditioning came. So, what is an operant? So, in Skinner's model, operands refers to behavior that are influenced by the consequence that follow them. Unlike reflexive responses in the classical conditioning, operands are voluntary behaviors that an organism performs, which then produce effects in the environment. So, operands are any behavior that an animal or a human performs, which are like voluntary behavior. So, for example, somebody walks, somebody sits, somebody plays. So, these are all voluntary behaviors that intentionally you do carry out certain behaviors, and each of these behavior has certain consequences. So, when an organism actively involved in a behavior voluntarily, all these kinds of behavior are called as operands. Now, if you look at classical conditioning, they are the behavior which was focused in classical conditioning are mostly reflexive processes, like saliva production on the site of food and so on. This is not a voluntary thing, it is an involuntary response. So, most of the classical conditioning situations were reflexive responses like fear responses and so on, automatically it happens. But in case of operant conditioning, an operant is mostly a voluntary action that an organism carries out in an environment, and obviously it produces certain effects in the environment, and depending on the effect the future course of action takes place. So, operands are actions that operate on the environment to produce outcomes, and these outcomes shape future behavior. So, any behavior or action that operates in an environment and voluntary in nature, all these kinds of action can be called as operands. So, Skinner was more interested into operands because most of the day to day actions are operands only. Very few of actions are actually in the reflexive category, but most of the behaviors that we do or an animal does are operands only, operant behaviors. So, its impact will be far reaching as compared to classical conditioning. So, Skinner's view is that a stimuli in the environment do not force the organism to behave or incite it to act. So, just presence of a stimuli automatically does not incite or stimulate any kind of action. Initial cause of behavior is the organism itself. It is the organism who decides to take an action. Just presence of any stimuli does not automatically will not stimulate an action. So, organism itself is the cause or kind of source of action. So, so there is a statement which very clearly explains what are these operands. So, there is no environmental eliciting stimuli for operant behavior. Operant behavior need not be carried out in response to some stimulus in the environment. You can just walk, sit, not because of some particular reasons, but those kind of behaviors will also be called as an operant behavior. It simply occurs. In the terminology of operant conditioning, operands are emitted by the organism. So, whatever organism does, for example, the dog walks, runs and romps, the bird flies, the monkey swings from trees to tree, the human infant bubbles vocally. In each of these cases, the behavior occurs without any specific eliciting stimulus. All these behaviors, if you say walking, running, fly, swinging, these are all not because of any specific stimulus that it causes this behavior. These are operant automatically voluntary behaviors originates in the organism itself. So, it is in the biological nature of organism to emit operant behavior. So, it is in the nature of organism that they will do various actions irrespective of whether it is stimulated or not. So, all these are collectively called as operands. Now, what is the process of this operant conditioning, how it happens? So, the basic concept behind operant conditioning is that what are the consequences of operands or any behavior that will determine the future course of actions. So, whenever an organisms or any humans or animals carry out certain actions, then there are certain consequences. Now, these consequences will determine what are the future course of actions or whether that particular behavior will be repeated or not. So, the whole process of operant conditioning is the association between the action and the consequences. So, one of the main principles within operant conditioning is the concept of reinforcement. Reinforcement basically in terms of Skinner model of learning, it means it is a central concept. It refers to any consequence that strengthens or increases the likelihood of a behavior being repeated. So, reinforcement is basically any consequence of a behavior which increases the likelihood of that behavior. So, if an action is reinforced, that means that action will probability of that action will increase in future. So, it is more like in more layman term we can say it is more like reward or any kind of rewarding experiences. So, any action that is that is kind of the consequence of any action when it is rewarding, the probability of that behavior in future also increases, because the person learned that if I do this action the consequences will be good. So, in that sense the reinforcement basically the idea is any consequence that increases the probability of behavior in future. So, that is more like a rewarding consequence. So, that is the meaning of reinforcement in the concept of operant conditioning. So, reinforcement can be positive or negative, but in both the cases probability of behavior will increase. So, that is the basic definition of reinforcement. So, when we say reinforcement, so basically probability of behavior increases. Only then we can call it as a reinforcement. So, any consequence that increases the probability will be called as a reinforcement. Now, this reinforcement can be of two categories, one is positive reinforcement and negative reinforcement. Now, positive reinforcement basically means it involves presenting a pleasant or rewarding stimulus after a behavior. Okay. So, when a person carries out an action, then the consequence of that action is rewarding or it is pleasant. Then it is called as a positive reinforcement. So, as a result of an action, some rewarding stimulus or any rewarding consequence is presented after the action. So, that is called as a positive reinforcement. So, something positive is presented after the action. As a result, the probability of that behavior increases. For example, here it is given an example, a teacher praises a student for completing their homework on time. This praise is a positive stimulus or positive reinforcement. It reinforces the behavior of timely submission. So, it is more likely that that particular student will also complete their homework on time in the future also, because one action of completing the homework was rewarded or praised by the teacher. So, the probability of that behavior increases in future. So, that is called positive reinforcement. Something positive is presented after the action, so then it is called as a positive reinforcement. Negative reinforcement is again a reinforcement, here behavior increases, but in a negative sense. How that is negative? It involves removing an unpleasant stimulus after the behavior. So, here something unpleasant is removed from you after as a consequence of that behavior. So, then also the probability of behavior increases. So, we can say reward can be in two categories. One is when I get something positive, so that is positive reinforcement. We also experience rewarding experience when something bad or negative is removed from our life. That is also a reward, because if something is disturbing in your life and if it is removed, you feel good about it. So, removal of a negative stimulus is also reward or is also reinforcement, and it is considered as a kind of it will increase the probability of that behavior. So, that is the meaning of negative reinforcement. So, something unpleasant is removed as a consequence of that behavior, and the probability of that behavior likelihood also increases in future. For example, a driver starts regularly obeying the speed limit to avoid receiving traffic tickets or fine, whatever, traffic fine. So, traffic fine is an unpleasant stimulus, because if the driver follows the traffic rule, this possibility of unpleasant stimulus decreases. So, this when this unpleasant stimulus is removed, so penalty or traffic ticketing he will not get. So, as a result he is more likely to drive within the speed limit or maintaining the traffic rule and so on. So, that is an example of a negative reinforcement. So, because fine or penalty is a negative stimulus, no one likes it. So, this will be removed if you follow the traffic rule. So, in that sense it is a negative reinforcement. For another example is, a person takes painkillers to relieve headache. So, the removal of the headache is a negative reinforcement, because headache, no one likes headache. So, if you take a pill or a medicine and it removes your headache, your probability of taking the pill in future also increases, because that will remove something negative and it is rewarding in that sense. So, these are examples of negative reinforcement. So, in case of negative reinforcement, something unpleasant is removed as a consequence of the behavior. In case of positive reinforcement, something positive is presented to you. The next concept within the operant conditioning is called punishment. Now, punishment basically means, in the Skinner's framework, punishment refers to the process by which a consequence is applied to decrease the likelihood of a behavior reoccurring in the future. So, this is different from reinforcement. In punishment, you present something, or you, as a consequence of the behavior, certain consequences are presented to the student or any kind of individual or organism to decrease the probability of that behavior. So, in case of reinforcement, either positive or negative reinforcement, probability of behavior increases. In case of punishment, when something is presented, mostly negative stimulus, then the probability of behavior decreases. So, in case of punishment, the basic idea is to decrease the behavior, so that this behavior does not occur in the future. In case of reinforcement, the focus is on increasing that behavior, so the probability of behavior increases. So, that is the basic difference between the punishment and reinforcement. So, punishment again can also be positive punishment or negative punishment, just like positive reinforcement, negative reinforcement, just in an opposite sense. So, punishment involves the presentation of an aversive stimuli. So, when you present something negative as a consequence of the behavior, then it is called as positive punishment. Means, for example, so you scold a child. If child does some bad behavior, parent scolds them. So, that is a kind of punishment, positive punishment. So, you are presenting something negative, scolding, a child does not like scolding. So, you are, as a consequence of the behavior, you are scolding that particular child. So, that is a case of kind of positive punishment. Now, punishment also includes removal of a pleasant stimulus. So, as we already explained, removal of an unpleasant stimulus is reward. Similarly, the removal of a pleasant thing is kind of also punishment. So, something that you like, but it is removed as a result of certain behavior. So, you do not like it. So, that also is a kind of punishment for a person. So, that is called as a negative punishment, both with the intention of reducing the frequency of particular behavior. So, in case of punishment, the focus is on reducing the behavior. In case of reinforcement, the focus is on increasing the behavior. So, we will see more specific examples. So, Skinners generally are against the use of punishment. So, Skinner was not really in favor of using punishment as a control of behavior, whose effects he found that generally tend to be temporary, and administration may lead to people rebel against the use. So, punishment, because the impact of punishment may not be very long term, it generally is short term, and many times people may rebel against the person or the sense of punishment or use of punishment. So, overall the effect of punishment may not be very productive as far as Skinner's perspective. So, he was not very favorable in terms of using punishment for controlling behavior. He was more in favor of using reinforcement for controlling behavior. So, throughout his career, Skinner emphasized the value of positive reinforcement in shaping behavior. So, he was more focusing on positive reinforcement, presenting something positive to increase a behavior. So, let us summarize what are the different concepts that we used. So, punishment we just discussed here. So, positive punishment is basically adding an unpleasant stimulus to decrease a behavior. For example, scolding a child for drawing on the walls. So, if a child does something bad like drawing on the wall, the parents comes and scolds that child. So, this is an example of a positive punishment. So, something negative is presented to decrease that behavior. Negative punishment is removing an pleasant stimulus. So, something pleasant is removed as a consequence of the behavior to decrease that behavior. For example, taking away a toy when a child misbehaves. So, a child loves a toy, but when it misbehaves, the parents take away that toy and says that if you do not behave properly, I will not give it. So, something positive is taken away. So, that is an example of negative punishment. So, this is about punishment. Positive reinforcement, as we said, it is adding a pleasant stimulus to increase the behavior, like giving a student praise for completing a homework. Negative reinforcement is removing an unpleasant stimulus to increase the behavior, like taking painkillers to decrease headache and so on. So, if you see outcomes, in both cases of positive reinforcement, negative reinforcement, it strengthens the behavior. In case of punishment, in both case of positive punishment and negative punishment, it weakens the behavior. So, these are some of the basic differences between the concept of. So, lot of our human behavior is shaped by these principles. Now, when we talk about reinforcement, Skinner was has done lot of detailed research on what kind of reinforcement, how it impacts, the varieties of reinforcement which are possible, in terms of applying reinforcement, and how all these types of different types of reinforcement impacts the outcome and so on. So, one of the concept in reinforcement, because reinforcement was mainly focused by the Skinner, he was not focusing much on punishment. So, he said one of the thing that can influence human behavior is not only just reinforcement or reward, but what are the schedules of this reinforcement, how it is given. So, that is also very important. Schedules of reinforcement means what is the pattern of giving reinforcement, that will also have an impact on human behavior, to what extent it is repeated. So, these are called schedules of reinforcement. So, reinforcement can be provided according to different schedules which affect how quickly and strongly behavior is learned and maintained. So, what kind of schedules are applied to for in case of reinforcement, that will determine how strongly something is learned or how strongly something is avoided and so on. Two major categories of schedules of reinforcement. One is continuous reinforcement. So, basically in this schedule a behavior is reinforced every time it occurs. So, continuous means every time a behavior is or action is performed by an individual or an organism, every time it is rewarded. So, that is a continuous reinforcement. So, whenever it happens, it is rewarded. So, every time it happens, there is a reward comes out of it. So, this is a case of continuous reinforcement. So, this is useful for establishing a new behavior, but can lead to rapid extinction if the reinforcement stops. So, initially to develop a good habits or some good behavior, continuous reinforcement can be a good strategy, but then it can also very easily and very soon it can stop also if reinforcement is stopped. That behavior may also get extinct very easily, because there is an expectation every time it is rewarded. Then the moment the reward stops, the behavior may also stop. So, that is called as a continuous reinforcement. Another is called as an intermittent or partial reinforcement. So, in this case of reinforcement, a behavior is not reinforced every time it occurs. There are several types of intermittent reinforcement. So, in the partial reinforcement, every time a behavior is shown by an individual or an organism, it is not rewarded. Sometimes it is rewarded, sometimes it is not. So, there can be varieties of partial reinforcement. So, let us see what are the possibilities in terms of intermittent or partial reinforcement. So, if you see schedules of reinforcement, one is continuous, one is partial. Within the partial, there can be interval schedule or there can be ratio schedule. Within the interval, there can be fixed interval schedule or there can be variable interval schedule. Within the ratio schedules, there can be fixed ratio schedule or there can be variable ratio schedules. Okay. So, let us see all of this, what are these partial schedules of reinforcement. So, fixed ratio schedule is when reinforcement is provided after a fixed number of response. For example, let us say in an animal experiment, a rat receives food pellets every 10th press of lever. So, we will see Skinner actually did most of his research using rats. So, the moment a rat shows certain behavior, the reward is given in terms of food pellets. So, let us say if the rat presses a lever in a box, so now every time it presses, it is not given reward like food, but let us say after 10 time lever is pressed by a rat, then the food is given. So, every 10th. So, that is called fixed ratio schedules. So, after every fixed number of time when an action is produced, then reward is given, not every time, after let us say every 5th time, every 6th, every 10th time and so on. So, certain fixed intervals are maintained in terms of giving reinforcement. So, that is called as a fixed ratio schedule. Ratio, basically when we say ratio, case of ratio schedules of reinforcement, here it is basically numbers of response. So, ratio means basically in terms of number of response. So, certain numbers, after certain numbers the reward is given. In terms of interval, it is time based. So, after certain number of time period, certain time period, the reward is given, which can be fixed time or can be variable time. In here it is ratio number of response, it may be fixed number of response, after a fixed number of response reward is given, or it is a variable number of response reward is given. So, when we say interval, it is time based, when it say it is ratio schedule, it is number of response based. So, the fixed ratio schedule means after a fixed number of times of response, like after every 10 time a response is shown, reward is given. Variable ratio schedule means there is no fixed pattern. Sometimes maybe second time, after second instance of the behavior reward is given, or then it may be after 5 instances, or then maybe after 10 instances. So, there is no fixed pattern. The individual cannot predict when I am going to get reward. You know, for example, lot of these gambling machines, slot machines are based on variable ratio schedules. So, people do lot of this gambling, you know, in slot machines, where you press and certain numbers comes, and then you know you get, if you get certain numbers, then certain, you know, prizes are there and so on. You do not know when this particular number is going, prize is going to come. Sometimes you may press, you know 10 times and nothing is coming, sometimes the first time it may come. So, there is no predictability there. So, that is an example of a variable ratio schedule. So, your reward, you are not able to predict when I am going to get reward, after how many numbers of times of responses. So, that is called as a variable ratio schedule. Now, fixed interval schedule, again interval means time based. So, after a fixed time you get a reward. Okay. For example, you know, reinforcement is provided for the first response after a fixed period of time. As for example, a worker receives paycheck every 2 weeks. So, after every 2 weeks or after every month you get a certain salary or paycheck. So, that is the reward based on fixed interval schedule. So, every month end you will get a salary. So, that is a fixed interval, every month you will get it, after every 30 days. So, that is fixed. So, that is called fixed interval schedule. Now, variable interval schedule, again you do not know after how much time you are going to get a reward. So, that the time period is variable, you cannot make a fixed time period. So, reinforcement is provided for the first response after a varying interval of time based on an average. For example, you know, checking for a text message might be reinforced on a 30-minute schedules, or messages comes at unpredictable times. You know, so we will see more details examples of this. So, here are again summarization of all the schedules of reinforcement. So, the last one we said the variable interval schedule. Here if you see here, reinforcement for the first response after varying intervals of time based on an average. So, again after varying interval of time you are likely to get the reward. For example, you know, teacher takes pop quizzes in a class. So, sometimes after a week the quizzes will be done, and sometimes maybe after 2 weeks. So, the students are not, they are not able to, you know, there is no fixed pattern. The student can say when I am going to get next class quizzes. Teacher make it very unpredictable in terms of variable interval. Sometimes maybe after 1 week there will be a quiz, or maybe after a month there will be quiz. So, students are not said in advance when they are going to get a quiz, and it can be any time. So, that is an example of a variable interval schedules of reinforcement. Fixed interval, as we already said, you know, after receiving most of the salary and paychecks after a certain interval time is fixed interval. A variable ratio schedule is like, you know, winning money on a slot machine. You can never predict when you are going to get a prize in the slot machine. Most of these gambling using slot machines are based on variable ratio schedule. Fixed ratio is again earning bonus on every 10 sales made, is an example of fixed ratio schedule. So, every 10 sale you make of a product, you will be get certain reward or bonus. So, that is an example of a fixed ratio schedule. In case of continuous reinforcement, as you see, every response is reinforced. Now, if you see how it impacts our behavior, to what extent, what are the patterns of behavior all these schedules of reinforcement develops within us. So, if you see continuous reinforcement, generally behavior that is formed by continuous reinforcement, they can very rapidly get extinct also, as we already explained. No? So, every time you are giving reward after a behavior, the moment reward stops, behavior is also very soon very likely to be likely to stop if the reward does not come after continuous rewarding. So, because the person understands, so every time I show this behavior, I should get a reward. The moment reward stops, the person will also stop showing those behaviors. So, these are low resistance behaviors created by continuous schedules of reinforcement. So, rapidly such kind of behaviors may stop. So, to maintain those kind of behavior, you have to every time you have to produce a reward. Fixed ratio, moderate resistant, whenever anything is fixed, because there is a predictability, so the resistance is generally low, but it is better than continuous reinforcement in terms of maintaining that behavior. So, moderate resistance. So, basically it is high response rate with post reinforcement pause. So, generally it is going to maintain moderate kind of resistance in terms of maintaining that behavior. Now, variable ratio schedule is it shows the highest resistance. Whenever a behavior is formed based on variable ratio schedule, then it is very difficult to get extinct. This behavior has a very strong resistance, it will not die very soon. So, that is why people in case of gambling and other thing, it becomes very difficult to stop gambling, because of this unpredictability. I may get reward today, even though the person may lose many times, but still there is an expectation, maybe next time I will get it. So, that predictability in the mind is very strong, it is very strongly created by variable ratio schedule. So, any behavior that is rewarded based on variable ratio schedule is more likely to be high resistance, and it is maintained for a long time. Fixed interval, again it is moderate resistance, not very high. A variable interval can be high, but highest resistance is shown by response based variable ratio schedule. Again, variable interval also is because you do not know when it is going to happen. So, again there is a more likely of high resistance, but highest resistance is shown by variable ratio schedule in terms of number of response, but it is unpredictable. So, unpredictability is one of the factors that creates more resistance in the behavior. So, in that case this creates the highest resistance. This is also creates kind of high resistance. So, response based schedules repeatedly generate higher level of response than interval schedules. So, giving reward based on the response is a better strategy than based on time in terms of resistance. Obviously, the time also has its influence in certain contexts. So, the highest response rate occurs within response based schedule that are variable. So, variable ratio schedule like slot machine and other gambling devices. So, that is why it is very difficult to stop gambling, because that behavior's resistance is very high. People generally maintain those behaviors because of this whole unpredictability created in the mind. So, sometimes they will get a very high reward, sometimes they may lose many times, but still that tendency is there, people do not stop it. Now, Skinner found all these concepts and other thing using a research and experiment in a box using rats basically, and then obviously these were applied in other human contexts. So, the box in which he did all this experiment is called as Skinner box. So, Skinner developed a laboratory apparatus known as Skinner box to study the effects of reinforcement on behavior. So, all these schedules of reinforcement, how it impacts behavior, everything was actually done in all these experiments were done on Skinner box. The Skinner box is customized depending on the organisms being studied. For instance, Skinner box designed for rats typically includes a lever that rat can press and a mechanism of delivering reinforcement. So, in the Skinner box, the idea was he was trying to see what is the effect of reinforcement on behavior. So, rat is supposed to show certain behavior like pressing a lever, and then automatically certain or there are possibility of giving reward in terms of food for an rats, and he used all these schedules of reinforcement, ratio, variable, fixed, everything, interval, all kinds of schedules he used and try to see how it impacts behavior. By presenting the reinforcement, reinforcer researcher observes whether the influence the frequency of the behavior such as lever pressing. So, they try to see and develop all these concepts. Skinner viewed this controlled environment as the ideal setting to study the fundamental principles of behavior. So, he used a more controlled study, more experimental setup to study all these concepts and their impact on behavior. So, this is how the Skinner box looked like. It is a kind of, so this is a lever which the rat can press. The moment it presses, certain food pellets, this is a dispenser where the food will come. So, the rat learns, if I do this, I am going to get food. So, that is how, and then how the food was given based on different all the schedules, and they try to see how what kind of how this reinforcement has an impact on the behavior of the rats, and this is how a lot of these experiments were done. Now, one of the concepts that comes out of this operant conditioning is the concept of shaping behaviors. For example, how do animals learn to do more complex than just a pressing a lever? So, in case of Skinner box, you might have seen this is just a simple behavior that rat was showing, like pressing a lever and so on. But how do a lot of animals are trained in terms of showing complex behaviors? Let us say if you go to zoo, if you go to some circus, one can see that animals are doing complex behaviors, like an elephant playing football and so on, which is not normally shown by animals, but how those complex behaviors are learned or taught to the animals and how that is possible. It is based on the concept of shaping, which comes from the operant conditioning. So, according to Skinner's, animal learn complex behavior through the process called shaping, which is also known as successive approximations. It is another name for shaping, successive approximations. How it is done? Shaping involves reinforcing increasingly complex behaviors, gradually leading to the final desired behavior. The organism's behavior is shaped through a series of steps until matches the desired response. So, here complex behaviors are learned one by one. So, so there is a final goal that you want to teach to that animal or human being for that matter. So, there needs to be a complex series of steps should be learned to show that behavior. For example, for teaching an elephant to kick a ball, lot of things has to be taught. The elephant has to learn or taught that this is an object, they should come near to it, then they should also touch it, then they should kick it. So, then they need to learn lot of steps before showing this the final behavior of kicking a football by an elephant, for example. So, that is the meaning of successive approximation. So, it is increasingly complex steps one after the other. So, each step, first initial step is taught by rewarding it, then once the animal learns this, then the next step, the moment it shows, then it is rewarded like that by giving reward and reward. For animal mostly it is food is the reward. Then the animals is shaped to show the final behavior. So, that is the concept of shaping. For example, if one wants a rat in a Skinner box to run around in circles, let us say you want to teach a rat to run around a circle. So, that is a complex behavior. Normally, it is not, it's much more complex than pressing a lever. So, they can simply wait for the rat to do so, then reinforcement. So, that is generally the rat may not show the circular movement, and then waiting for it may not be a feasible thing. So, instead they can use this concept of shaping to show this behavior. For example, the process may involve reinforcing simpler response such as running. So, the once rat runs, he is reinforcement. So, the rat will learn running will give me reward. Then waiting until animal starts to run in curved path. The moment then if animal or the rat starts running in a curved path, which we want, which is one of the desired thing that from the experimenter perspective, then again the rat is rewarded. So, the rat learns, no, I should not only run, but run in a curved path. Then reinforcement at that point, subsequently waiting until it runs at least in the half circle. Then at least half circle may, once the rat runs, it is again rewarded, then it understands that this is a rewarding path, then ultimately continue this process until the animal trained to run in circles. So, like this, approximation, successive approximations, each steps, different steps are designed, and each steps, once the animal shows, it is rewarded, then the next step, like this, the final complex behaviors can be shaped or learned. Skinner recognized that this step by step process of successive approximation is not only applicable to animal training, but also to complex human learning. This method is commonly used in animal training such as circuses, zoos and so on. So, such kind of shaping could also be used in human learning, that we will also talk about now little bit now. There is something called as a token economy, is also another process of which also used mostly in human context. So, token economy is a behavior modification. So, it can help to modify behavior based on principles of operant conditioning, something called as a token economy. It involves using tokens as a secondary reinforcement to encourage desirable behaviors. Tokens are tangible items like coins, stars, points or stickers given as a reward for specific behaviors. These tokens are later exchanged with primary reinforcements such as money, candy, etc. So, in token economy, what is given? The once mostly it is used in certain settings like children who are, let us say, mentally retarded or specially specially able children, and then in some school settings also used, some psychiatric patients. Such kind of token economy can be helpful in terms of shaping behaviors of those cases and teaching them to learn certain behaviors like their day to day activities and so on. So, basically what happens here, a secondary reinforcement is given. The once a desired behavior is shown by a person, some tokens are given. Now, these tokens are mostly secondary reinforcements, they are not directly valuable things, but they can be given like certain points will be given, or certain stars point will be given, or certain stickers will be given. So, then you keep collecting that, the more you show these behaviors, you will get more of these points, and these points you can give exchange them with direct reinforcement like money or some candy in case of children and so on. So, that is why this is a kind of promoting certain behaviors. Specific behaviors identified as desirable and targeted for reinforcement are called target behaviors. It may include completing homework for children, following rules, participating in activities or exhibiting social skills. In various contexts, such token economies can be used to shape behaviors or promote certain behaviors. This system is widely used in various settings including schools, psychiatric hospitals, rehabilitation centers, where certain people are not able to even carry out their daily activities or daily functions or actions that are required. So, they can be taught to do this and rewarded, and based on that they can be shaped to do certain behaviors. For example, in a token economy hospitalized psychiatric patients may receive reinforcement tokens for activities such as serving meals or cleaning floors. They can be shaped, or they can be kind of certain behaviors like cleaning and serving meals, and those kind of activities can be promoted by using token economy. In tightly controlled environment like state hospitals for long term psychiatric patient, it is feasible to make almost anything a patient wants contingent on this desired behavior. So, this method can be applied in a much more successful way, especially in this kind of tightly controlled environment like hospitals, psychiatric hospitals and so on, where patients are not able to do lot of activities because of their mental conditions. So, they can be slowly taught to learn lot of things by using these token economies. Research support the effectiveness of token economies in increasing behavior such as social interaction, self care, job performance in severely disturbed patients and individuals with intellectual disabilities. So, this kind of, for this kind of patient, this kind of token economies really serves a very important strategy for promoting certain behaviors. They have also been used in decreasing aggressive behaviors in children and reduce marital discord and so on. So, in various contexts this can be used, more specifically with the children and psychiatric patients, intellectual disabilities, children with or people with intellectual disabilities. In such cases, token economies can serve very useful purposes. Now, Skinner view on personality, how he did views on personalities. His views on personality are very similar to what other behaviorists viewed it. The Skinner's theory of personality basically it's a departure from other structural component like psychoanalysis and so on, structural concepts or theories. Skinner was not again interested, just like behaviorism, he was not interested in explaining behavior or personality using internal concepts. He was mostly focusing on how behaviors are shaped from the environment. Like in this case, he was more interested into how reinforcement shapes human behaviors, and it may include all kinds of behaviors where certain patterns and personality characteristics could also be explained using those things. While theorists like Freud, Rogers, Alport, Eysenck and Cattell, most of them we have already discussed, utilize structural concepts such as different kind of concepts to explain internal concepts to explain human personality. Skinner's approach minimizes all these structures and concepts inside human being. He was not interested into those things. Skinner's perspective therefore focused on observable behaviors and their response to external situational forces rather than from underlying psychological structures. So, that was a basic thing about all behaviorists including Skinner. So, this approach aligns with all the behaviorist beliefs and other behaviorist ideas. Skinner's perspective on human motivation was also very straightforward, which is also an important aspect of personality. He believed that human beings are primarily motivated to produce pleasant events and avoid painful events whenever possible. So, that was basic idea behind motivation, that human motivation can be explained very simply and very clearly, that humans are motivated to produce pleasant events or pleasant consequences. So, they will be motivated to get positive reinforcement in their life, and they will always try to avoid painful events whenever possible. So, that is the basic concept of motivation according to Skinner, based on getting pleasures and avoiding pain. So, according to Skinner, all of the emotional states, emotions can also be understood by analyzing behavioral events in the environment that preceded them. What events led to the cause or development of these emotions, those environmental events can be used to explain emotions, not internal construct according to Skinner. While he acknowledged that some behaviors are private, he rejected the idea that internal private behavior causes emotions. So, that causal factors he was always looking at external factors. So, that was the basic idea of all behaviorists. In Skinner's view, emotions such as anxiety are not caused by anxious personality characteristics. According to him, anxiety is rather something in the environment that stimulates the anxious behavior, just like classical conditioning paradigm we discussed in the last lecture. So, some kind of conditioning that happens from the environment leads to things like personality with anxious personality or neurotic personality and so on. So, therefore, according to Skinner, emotions are responses to external stimuli rather than being driven by internal private experiences. So, the focus is on the external. This perspective aligns with Skinner's broader behavioral approach, which emphasizes the role of observable behavior and external environment in shaping human motivation, emotions and personality. Skinner extensively scrutinized Freudian concept in his writing, dismisses most of them as unscientific. So, he dismissed most of the concept of psychoanalysis, saying that they are unscientific, and we have already discussed this criticism of psychoanalysis in the last module. While he agreed with Freud regarding some of the idea that early childhood experiences have lasting effects that can persist in adulthood, He argued that it was early conditioning experience of the child that shaped late behavior rather than the influence of inner conflicts. So, his explanation was different. Freud was explaining inner conflicts and unconscious mental factors in terms of determining personality. Skinner also agreed that childhood experiences are very important, but not in terms of inner conflicts, but based on what are the environmental impact the child had during the childhood, that will play a more important role. Skinner acknowledged that personality traits such as friendly, enthusiastic provide useful description, no doubt they are useful in terms of describing individuals, but he argued that these traits names do not explain in any empirical way how they are developed. They are useful in description, but how they developed, this just naming and trait names may not be of any help. For Skinner, a friendly person, for example, has been reinforced more for being friendly than for unfriendly reasons. So, a person become friendly because the friendly behavior was reinforced again and again, so that behavior increased within that person. So, this is how he explained most of these personality characteristics. In other words, according to Skinner, personality traits are the result of differential reinforcement. Individuals learn and develop specific personality trait based on consequences of the behavior. If some behavior is reinforced again and again, they are more likely to show that behavior, and that may become part of their personality. So, these are some of the things about behavioral perspective. So, operant conditioning we discussed in today's lecture, and it plays very important role in behaviorism, and it expanded this whole paradigm of behaviorism, and it became a proper school of thought from the operant conditioning perspective. So, if you look at a behavioral perspective, they are not much interested into the explaining human personality as such using all the structural concept. Their explanations are very simple, that whatever the human nature develops, it is because of the effect of the environment and how the person, what kind of consequences that happened as a result of certain behaviors, what kind of conditioning has happened. So, their explanations, all explanation comes basically to conditioning. So, these are some of the concepts related to how behaviorism can explain human personality. With this, I stop here. Thank you.